Welcome. My name is Ian Matthes. I am a North Fulton Master Gardener and a Master Gardening Extension Volunteer Program volunteer. Thank you for joining today's presentation. We'll be discussing growing figs at home, an introduction to growing figs in the Southeast for the home gardener. You may have seen in some of the intro slides during the opening timer. If you have questions, please make sure you put those in the comments. We will have a question and answer session at the end. All participants are muted, and we'll try to get all of your questions answered. We're also live streaming this on Facebook, and it'll be recorded for YouTube, so it'll be available for viewing later as well. Again, my name is Ian Matthes. I'm a part of the pandemic class of 2020 with the Master Gardening Program. I'm an attorney of about 25 years, and as the slide says, I'm seeking the green acres life here in the suburbs when I'm not practicing law, with my family, and growing and gardening in all different aspects. I've been doing this for about 10 years, and I've developed a real affinity for figs, and this is not the fiddle-leaf figs or whatnot, but the edible figs. And I have over 100 varieties right now. Need to probably go check some of the winter damage from the hard freezes we just have, but I'm really enjoying expanding that collection and the diversity. I'm also an autism dad and girl dad, and I love that both my kids eat figs very well, and it's part of my inspiration to continue expanding my collection. For today's agenda, we're going to talk about a number of topics. We have them listed here. First off, what are figs? Again, we're going to be focusing on Ficus corica, which are the edible figs. We have a number of pictures of figs from my garden on the right. We're going to look at why we grow figs, or why someone might want to grow figs. We're going to talk about fig origins. We're going to talk about several different types of figs. We're going to look at the different fig crops. Some figs produce more than one crop per year. We're going to look at reproduction, whether that's sexual, asexual, grafting, a lot of other topics there. We're going to talk generally about growing figs and some things that you can do to be more successful in your own garden. We're going to discuss a number of varieties of figs, and you'll see pretty quickly that there's really a broad range, a spectrum of different figs that are available. And very important to me, acquiring figs and how I think you can best position yourself to get a number of different types of figs and find out what might be best for your palate and for the area where you're growing them. Figs are referenced all the way back into biblical times and beyond. They were one of the first domesticated agricultural crops. Great nutritional source, especially in days before some fruits and vegetables were as readily available. Figs can be very easily grown in the Southeast, although we do have different challenges. Challenges here in the Southeast may be very different from our fig friends up in New England or Pacific Northwest, and definitely different from the opportunities in California. And some people say, why aren't they often seen? And once you're familiar with figs and their growth and what they look like, as you're driving down the road like me, you might notice figs in a number of places. I've noticed them going down the road, and always keep in mind, I wonder what type they're growing there. So for many of you like me, first experience with figs was a fig Newton baked cookie. I still like them, but I think you're going to find that the flavor of a fresh fig, all the different types, you're really going to realize how different they are and how wonderful they can be fresh. Most of you probably never see fresh figs available, maybe occasionally in August or so at Trader Joe's. A lot of that is because figs don't ripen once they've been picked, so it's hard to have them available as a commercially viable produce at the stores. So looking to why grow figs, first and foremost, a lot for me is the fig trees are easy to grow and to propagate. They're sometimes can be a little tricky to start when you're first starting them from cuttings, which we'll get into. Once they get going, they love living, and they can survive a lot. Even when we've had real hard freezes, some that have frozen to the ground can come back and keep growing. So it's very vigorous. Another for me was that the figs start producing fruit a lot more quickly than some fruit trees. I have pomegranates that I know that I'm going to be waiting several years before I see any real production. Same with some of the citrus. I've had some figs started 1 year, and I've actually been able to eat figs within the same year as I've started them from cuttings. So fruit in the first year is not at all unusual. I find that the foliage is very decorative. There are many, many different types of leaf structures and shapes, different textures. And sometimes as the young tree is growing, you might even see multiple leaf shapes even on the same fig tree. Most of us, I think, here in the Southeast, for the most part, have seen Celeste and Brown Turkey, which until I got into figs, I didn't understand that they're really talking about the country and not the bird. But there are over 2,000 cultivars in existence. And as we'll talk about in the sexual production of figs, there's a lot of variety that's still coming out. We are still discovering new varieties of figs in areas where they have the sexual reproduction as well. So in looking at why personally I grow figs, I have a love for fig jam. I have a love for fresh figs. And my kids eat them. That's definitely a part of it. So I have a picture of some of the fig jam that I made. This is actually a fig with some elderberry in it as well. I had placed in my yard a brown turkey and a Celeste, which I eventually found out were both Celeste because of some mislabeling at the box store. And I started researching figs, and I heard about a fig called the St. Rita. Rita was my first mother-in-law, who unfortunately passed at a young age. And when I saw that there was a St. Rita, I had to get one and grow it and enjoy it and share it with my family and share it with other family members who cherish her memory. So it's very, very personal. It's also what I'd say is probably one of my absolute favorite figs. And the picture on the bottom right with the dye is extremely perfectly ripe St. Rita fig, and it's probably the best I've ever had. There's a lot of variety in figs. As we'll go through the varieties later in the presentation, you really see that you're going to see green with an amber center. You'll see purple with a dark center, purple with amber. There's a whole rainbow of combinations, and different people enjoy different figs and different flavors. I love the fact that I can grow figs and expand my collection through some of the acquisition techniques that we talk about later for almost no cost. So figs aren't native to the Americas. In fact, if you see the map here, you'll see that it's mostly surrounding the Mediterranean and Mideast. And that is because of how figs outside of asexual propagation are pollinated and grow. These areas are relatively freeze-free, and that enables the process that we'll talk about to occur. Figs also can produce this way in California now, which we'll get back into. So I'll also discuss on the varieties that there is actually one fig that originated from Georgia, although it was part of the educational process in breeding. I am probably going to say dozens of times during this presentation that we talk about the fruit of a fig. I routinely refer to it as fruit. Technically, it's not fruit. The fig is actually an inflorescence, which is a cluster of many flowers and seeds contained inside a bulbous stem. I kind of refer to it as an inside-out flower. We'll go more into the parts of the fig and how that comes into play. So when you have a fig that is growing off a branch, you have the peduncle or stem. You have inside the inflorescence, you have female and male flowers. We refer to this as the synconium or false fruit. And it also has there at the bottom, the ostiole, which is also called the fig eye. We may talk about different figs having a more open eye, a more closed eye, and that's definitely something to keep an eye, no pun intended, on for figs here in the Southeast, because as everyone here in the Southeast knows, we have a slight issue with humidity and moisture in a number of our locations. So this is another shot of the ostiole of a fig, and there is a very, very small wasp that you'll see on it. And this is part of the reproductive process of figs. Each variety, most varieties, different types of figs, so Ficus coerica being one, will have a wasp that is specific only to that type, and they help in the reproduction. These are not wasps like the paper wasps or others that we're going to see growing nests on the underhangs of our houses. Extremely small wasp. So when we talk about different types of figs, figs are actually one of the types of plants that have a male, generally a male and a female type. The male capra figs, if you ever hear someone say a capra fig, that is going to be the male. It has male and female flowers, but they're considered because they produce pollen. This is the source for pollination for the female figs, and really generally only occurs through the use of the wasp, with some exception. Most of these are not edible. There are edible capra figs, although we probably aren't going to see any in the Southeast unless somebody's specifically looking to bring something like that in. So the first major type of fig group, the female, the Smyrna. Most of us are familiar with those from our Fig Newton days. These are figs that must be pollinated in order for them to set fruit. Again, inflorescence fruit. They can only produce the fruit if they are pollinated by the fig wasp. Without the pollination, they won't ripen. They'll shrivel a bit and drop off. They always drop their fruit. And there are many, many commercial types of figs grown. I think the one in the picture here was one that on occasion I'll pick up from, I think, Costco. There's a number of different locations that have these. You'll see other types of Turkish figs or other figs dried. And I will again say that the flavor of a dried fig, while I love it, and I love the seed crunch and everything there, it's going to be extremely different from enjoying a fresh fig. The next type of fig, which is still going to be a female, is a San Pedro. And the San Pedro's kind of in between the Smyrna and the common fig, which we'll discuss next. The San Pedro can only ripen the Breva or Breva crop. There's different pronunciations there. And we'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about the different types of crops. In this type, you're going to have an early crop, the Breva, that will ripen without pollination, but the main crop or later will not. So the main crop's going to drop later. They can be grown here in the Southeast, but I think most of the San Pedro that I see being grown are more in the Northwest, where some of the cooler climates really benefit it. And the major focus for me and focus for you here in the Southeast is going to be on the common fig. I had a friend recently ask me, Ian, you grow all these figs, how do you pollinate them? It's a simple answer, I don't. And for all of you who've grown up here in the South and you've had fig jams and picked figs and seen these are all going to be common figs, they're not going to need the pollination. They are going to have seeds in different varieties. They're going to have different amounts of figs and different fig crunch, as we call it. Fig crunch is generally if you're eating a fig, and some will be a little seedier than others and have a little more crunch. I happen to like that. There's some even that are referred to as seedless, although there's almost seeds. So if you're trying to grow a fig, growing it from seed won't work for your common figs. And I'll have some cautions about trying to do it from pollinated seeds as well. So, and again, some of these common figs can ripen up to 3 crops of figs every year. I'm usually sort of starting maybe late June and go all the way until the freeze, usually around or just after Halloween. The Breva the Breba crop again is on the San Pedros and some common figs, and these are the first crop of the year, and they're only going to develop on last year's growth or older growth. Some winter damage may prevent this crop from coming out, like I'm experiencing after this year. Usually ripens May to July in our areas, depending on the variety, depending on your conditions. And if you have a variety that does have the Breba first crop, it probably will affect your pruning strategy. How much of the Breba do you want? Some Breba crops are actually larger and better than the main crop. And so knowing your variety really helps out in that regard. Looking at a example here, this is a indoor fig where you're seeing Breba starting to grow on old growth. And you'll see the Breba crop starting to bud and grow. Apologies, I got that one upside down. And then they'll more fully develop. Once this crop is done, picked and enjoyed, you'll see the new growth starting at the tops. You'll see the greenery and foliage growth and the branch growth, and that's where you'll see the main crop. Here's an example of one variety that has a Breba crop, the Uncle Corky's Honey Delight. I think I have seen this commercially available down at the Pikes here in Roswell before. They're available in different spots as well. Main crop, and this is the real focus of most of my growing. Most common figs can produce 1 to 2 main crops. Some will continue to ripen continuously until frost. Others might ripen only at a short window. And one thing that I do enjoy about having so many types of figs is different figs ripen at different times. So with a good spectrum of figs, you can enjoy figs for several months in a row. These are going to develop only on the new growth. And some varieties can still produce a main crop fig even after what we call total dieback, especially as you get further into the colder areas of the Southeast. Some fig trees may even freeze down to the ground. You'll have new branches and shoots that will start from the ground, and it's possible to have figs that will grow even on that brand new first year growth. So generally July to October in our area, which I don't know how many different states we have visiting, but I'm sitting in Georgia, North Georgia. I know this is true up into Chattanooga and into North Carolina a bit as well. We're going to talk a little bit about reproduction. So reproduction, they can be reproduced from seed where the female flowers must be cross-pollinated with male pollen from the capra figs again. And the fig wasp that we talked about is the agent of pollination. So we'll have a diagram on the slide to show how this occurs. There are some opportunities where if you have the capra fig, a Smyrna or other types of figs, even common, can be pollinated by hand. It's quite an arduous process, but this is also one of the sources for development of new figs, which has been done. LSU had a program for a good while, and we'll talk about one that was done here in Georgia as well. So looking at the life cycle, you'll have the wasp that is found, that has gone into a male capra fig. They've hatched in the male capra fig and leave. They go out to find, usually I think they're really trying to find other male capra figs because there's better opportunity to reproduce, but they invariably make their way into the female figs. When they go in, generally some people say it's a little gruesome. The figs, the wasps go in, they lose their wings on the way in, they go in, they share their pollen, they pollinate that fig. And this is, many of you may have heard a rumor that some of the figs that you're going to eat, the fig Newtons and otherwise, oh, I heard they have a dead wasp inside. I've heard this for years and years. In that case, in a pollinated fig, technically, I guess that's true, but the fig absorbs every last instance of that wasp. becomes part and it's used, and there's probably, just walking down the street here in the Southeast, you're probably going to breathe in and inhale more insects than you're ever going to find in a pollinated fig. So I would not be concerned. I would still even consider them vegan, and especially on the common figs we're going to talk about in the Southeast, you're not going to find the wasps, so no concerns there. So fertilized seeds do not produce offspring true to the parents. I get frustrated sometimes if I see people selling seeds for a specific type of fig on eBay or other places. It's not going to grow the same fig. Really, the chances of having a common fig, one that can grow without pollination here in the South, if you were to plant 1,000 seeds, maybe you would get one. There are other things that there are other things that can increase those odds, and those are utilized in some of the agricultural programs. But for the most part, can you grow figs from seeds from figs bought at the dried figs bought at the store? Yeah, that can happen. I have done it, but for the most part, I look to that just as rootstock. I'm not going to plan to have edible figs resulting from that. So I would generally caution people, don't bother with starting figs from seeds, and definitely don't be had online buying them. So figs very rarely ever propagated for seed. Some fig hunters out in California do look for new trees that might have been started, but for the most part, they're going to be capra figs, although some new varieties are found. So the common figs, like I mentioned, they don't require pollination in order to ripen fruit. We do not have the fig wasp present in the Southeast, and that's for the most part because we're going to have more of an opportunity for freeze. We haven't had them originate here, nor have they been brought here. In fact, in California, they tried to start a fig agricultural program for several years. They couldn't get any of the figs to remain. Somebody finally realized we need capra figs and we need the wasp, and they were imported, and this was back in the 1800s. Nurseries in our area, for the most part, are only going to carry common figs. On occasion, you'll see a San Pedro, you'll see a Desert King, but for the most part, not something that we need to be concerned with here in the Southeast. So for the most part, everything that we're going to do here, and this is an absolute passion and love of mine, is the asexual propagation of figs. It's something that really attracts me to them because I can create a lot of new trees, or I can start trees and by trading, and I'll get into acquiring figs in a bit, but I think it's something that really makes growing figs and expanding your collection very easy. So we're going to talk about a couple different areas. We're going to look at by cuttings, by air layer, and by ground layer, and they generally root very easily. So in terms of rooting by cuttings, you have several examples of cuttings off on the right. Cuttings, there are ways to do green growth cuttings, but for the most part, I will focus here on having dormant cuttings. Usually I wait until after we've had a first good frost or a little bit of a freeze to take the cuttings. And you'll notice each of the cuttings, I'm going to look away for a second. If you see my mouse, there are several nodes on each of these figs. And you'll have one node where a leaf may start and another where a fig. Each of these nodes is a growth opportunity for that cutting. So usually if I'm looking for cuttings, I want to have at least 3 or 4 nodes. There are multiple ways of rooting figs. You can, my friend Angel over at Two Angel Mushrooms has some videos up. There are a number of them on YouTube. I'll also refer to a forum called ourfigs.com, which I have to give credit for the vast majority of my knowledge about figs. It's an amazing, welcoming group, and they talk about probably 10 different ways of rooting cuttings. The one shown here is called the fig pop, because once the cutting is put into a growth medium in the bag, it sort of looks like a giant lollipop. Generally, you expose a little bit of the cambium layer. Doesn't have to happen. You can use rooting hormones. It's not necessary. I have better luck using it. And then in a slightly damp rooting medium, the roots will start to grow. I always like to see the roots starting to develop and grow before the leaves. And one common question that I get is, well, how damp do you want it? I usually like to have the medium where I can't squeeze any water out of it. It's only mildly moist. And unfortunately, it's one of these things that I refer to kind of like making good scratch homemade Southern biscuits. You sort of know the consistency when you know it, and it's a lot of trial and error, but I probably run at about an 85% success rate, 85 to 90% success rate when starting figs from cuttings. The different methods will have different results for different people. Another very common method, which I've used a number of times, is grafting. And I know that we've had a number of discussions on the North Fulton Master Gardening program about grafting, about fruit trees. If you want to get a new type of fig very quickly, this is definitely a way to do it. I would probably look to go early spring to graft the scion wood from one variety onto a new type. When I mentioned having rootstock from the seeds, this is where I would use that. It's also a great opportunity to create what we sometimes call a Franken fig, or a cocktail fig, where you have multiple varieties growing off of one tree. Very successful. There's several different methods, everything from banana grafts, chip buds, tongue and groove. There's a lot of different ways to do this. I will caution you, though, if you do have a grafted fig, you probably want to consider some sort of winter protection during hard freezes, because if you do have a die back to the ground, you're going to be back to the bottom stock that's actually rooted. Then there are air layers, and air layers are definitely one of my favorite ways to propagate figs from something I already have. I do this a lot to share figs or to trade them. An air layer is basically where you wrap a portion of the stem, especially with or near a node, in a growth medium. I've used sphagnum moss a bit. I've used Pro Mix. There's a lot of different options where you wrap that fig in a lightly moist medium and wrap it in some sort of a container to hold it. I generally recommend, in the example here, you'll see it's a clear container. I think it's a Tupperware that someone's used. I do recommend wrapping it in aluminum foil or something like that, because roots generally don't like sunlight. And once the root is formed in that air layer, it's just cut off the parent tree, and then you can plant the new air layer. I have probably my best success with this method. I do remove the outer bark layer and apply rooting hormone generally before I put the growing medium on it. Similarly, ground layers, a number of you, if you're avid gardeners, may have ground layered other plants. It's basically when you take one branch of the fig, bend it down, and have it placed at and below soil level, or pin it down and hold and add more soil on top of it. You can use rooting hormone. Some people will give it a little bit of a break or a scrape of the bark, sometimes adding the hormones, and roots will generally start growing from the area where it was placed under the ground. At that point, you can cut it off the main plant and replant it. I like the air layer a little bit better because I can unwrap and take a look to see where the roots are without having to dig it up to see if I've had success thus far. I've had air layers take and be ready to cut off in as few as 18 days. Generally, I try to give them a month or two. In terms of growing figs, growing in ground, I am moving toward growing figs more in ground. Of the 100 varieties, I probably only have 10 in ground right now. And a lot of that, the reason for that is I was deciding what I really love best. I only have so much ground, so I want to make sure I'm putting what I truly love and does well in my area in ground. This is where you can see some really large trees grow. You have a lot more room for it to expand and grow. Overall, better production. If you put one in ground, usually the first year or so can be a little slower than in a container. but long-term, definite overall better production. You can have lower water requirements, lower fertilizer requirements, less maintenance. Although with it being in ground and outside, there's some other things that you need to deal with pest and maintenance and everything else, though. Some of the cons for growing outside, subject to winter freeze, as I meant, they can take up a good bit of space depending on your pruning habits. You could, have 10 to 16 feet between trees, or heavily pruned and maintained, sometimes on a 6-foot center. Definitely takes some work. You're going to lose more to birds, squirrels. I can tell you raccoons and figs. Raccoons and possums also love them. And I usually try to grow enough where I can share with everybody. I do get a bit of trunk damage, usually over the winter from rabbits that will try to gnaw the outer bark off some of the lower branches, as well as deer, especially with their rubbing and feeding. And some, depending on their size, may require some winter protection, wrapping, heavy mulching, tenting during very cold snaps. So I strongly recommend, here in the Southeast, we want to find a minimum of 8+ hours of direct sun. I know people that say my figs just aren't producing. So, well, they're kind of in the shade. They really want to have, these are Mediterranean plants. They're going to want the sun and they're going to love it. You'll see I mentioned that sometimes people plant figs on the south side of the structure, and that's really just for warmth retention and microclimate development to give them a little more winter protection. Recommending to choose some cold tolerant varieties and early varieties if you're in a colder area. Generally don't plant the San Pedros in ground. If you're going to look for a big tree, 10 to 15 foot spacing. I don't go that wide, but I also have an avid pruner. And one thing that I didn't do at first, but I've learned since then, is you want to plant wide, not deep. I've actually had some figs in containers where I let them sit for a little too long and they rooted through the bottom of the container, and I found roots growing out each direction 8 feet. So they love to run their roots horizontally and not vertically. So make sure that you have a good wide area. Generally well-draining soil is preferred, although, like I said, figs can be really hardy and they will dig into the clay that we have here. So growing figs in containers, this is probably the majority of mine. There's an opportunity to prevent winter damage, generally by taking them into a garage or other structure. They can be portable, although as I get older every year, it's a little less easy to move, especially the figs in 55-gallon containers. It gets a little bit tough. Main reason for this is better control over your environmental conditions, but it's a great way to trial some new varieties and to get stuff started, and make sure that this is one that you're going to invest in an in-ground placement. You can get an early jump on the growing season. I've actually had some, I don't know if anyone saw a video I did earlier with Fulton Master Gardeners on hydroponics and indoor gardening. I have the same grow lights that I've actually overwintered figs with, ripened them inside and enjoyed them. So you can get a head start for the spring with that, same as I do with my citrus. There's different soil mixes. There's a 5-1-1-1, which is generally pine barks or pine fines with peat moss or coconut coir and perlite and calcinated clay. If you go to rfigs.com, there'll be a link here at the end. They have a whole section discussing growth medium and different mixes. I actually got at one point where I was using a large cement mixer to mix up all the potting mix for all my container gardening. Some of the cons, the pot size is going to reduce the potential. You're going to have more watering. You're going to have a little more fertilizer requirement. There's what we call the fig shuffle. Here's a picture of a bunch of figs in someone's garage during the winter. And sometimes during the early spring, when they start to leaf out, you need to bring them out during the day, put them back in for a freeze. Kind of, as much as I hate hardening off new plants, this is the same reason why I'm currently not doing the winter fig shuffle. And I think it's a little more expensive because you have all of the growth medium that you're going to have them in. You're going to have the containers and everything else. So if you are going to grow in containers or start them and eventually put them in ground, I'd say make sure you harden off your trees in the spring, same as you would any plant. Again, 8+ hours of sun. For the container gardening, I would say starting at bud break. That's when you're first going to see the green growth starting to pop out. Fertilize every 2 weeks with a balanced fertilizer, maybe early, one with a little more nitrogen. At fruit set, switch to higher phosphorus, and then mid-September or earlier if you have an earlier first freeze or frost, because we don't want them to continue the vegetative growth that could be more susceptible to freeze and frost damage. Here in the South, especially if we get a really rainy season, you might see leaves starting to turn yellow, get some brown spots and drop off. There is a fungal growth that is called fig leaf rust. Generally, everyone asks, when do I apply it? Usually, if you're going to apply a fungicide, I really like the copper products, the organic products. Usually you need to apply it several weeks before you know you need to. And I know that doesn't help much, but if you know that you're going to have a very humid and rainy session coming up, get it out there applied before it really starts to hit. Also, you need to have some other protection from heavy rains. At certain times when you know your figs are just starting to swell, if you have a really rainy season, some may split. And if I don't remember, at some point I want to address when to pick figs. I might have to get that in the Q&A. My figs currently, until I get my irrigation system set, it'll take me about an hour to go out and water everything. In the heat of our summer here north of Atlanta, sometimes that can take me an hour. So I'm definitely looking at moving more to drip irrigation. With some of the pests, with the bird damage, we use, many of us use these organza bags. You'll see one shown here in the picture. You'll sometimes see rice or other things put in these, or wedding favors, and they're extremely cheap. They go over the fig in cinches, and it'll keep the birds away from them generally, although some of the other mammalian pests will go right through the bags. In terms of growing figs, there are a number of different ways to prune them. A lot of different people have different pruning styles. Everyone asks, Ian, when do you prune your figs? My answer is, if you were going to lose a limb, would you rather be awake or asleep? So I usually look for after pretty good frost or freezes, generally here in North Atlanta, January or February, although it was really early this February, so I'm glad I got a jump start. And a lot of your pruning method is going to depend on what style of tree are you looking to grow. A lot of figs naturally want to be very bushy with a number of trunks. I like a lot of times more of a tree form, especially a tree into a tulip. And I'll have some that I'm going to try to espalier at some point. It's a beautiful example here in the picture. The figs do very well with that. I think figs and pears are some of my favorites for that method. Fertilizing and when, and depending on my schedule and everything else that I have, and how busy I am, I'm still a full-time attorney. Sometimes I get pretty easy and just go with the 10-10-10 and go out, but I always try to get it at first bud break. I already have bud break now, so I'm probably a couple days behind. I'll get that done this coming up weekend. The type varies, but I wouldn't go especially after the first application with something with very heavy nitrogen. It really drives a lot of the vegetative growth versus the fruit set. Other care that you want to look at, dormant spray. I try to do a normal dormant spray over the winter. I think it overall provides better tree health, prevents some of the bark pests and everything else. Critical for us in Georgia right now, ambrosia beetles. I don't know how many people have had any of these in any of their other plants, trees, crepe myrtles, anything. Ambrosia beetles. If you've ever seen a little what looks like a toothpick sticking out of the trunk of a plant that sort of breaks off like dust, that's an ambrosia beetle. Generally, if the ambrosia beetle gets into the trunk, it's going to infect it, and I'd recommend just removing that trunk or portion of the tree before it infects and possibly kills the entire plant. That's probably my biggest challenge right now, and there's a number of different methods to address that I could probably do a whole nother presentation just on that. Another we're seeing more is the spotted wing the SWD. I hate that last word, so I won't pronounce it. And it's almost like a small fruit fly. They'll come in usually late summer, and once they start getting into a fig, it almost turns it to a fermented mush. So there's a number of, I prefer organic solutions for that, platooning, different options there. Always remember the label's the law. We do have some occasional scale issues. I found that that's fairly easily remedied. And then issues with deer and rabbits. The worst rabbit damage I've had is when I've had a rabbit chew the outer bark around, basically girdling the tree. So I'll usually lose that branch. I want to talk about a number of different types of figs. I'll probably go through these a little bit quickly. Celeste and Brown Turkey are probably the most common figs that you're going to find here in the Southeast. I think the Celeste is probably the easiest fig if you're going to grow one fig here in the South. Is it my favorite flavor or best fig? No. Can you get good volume out of them and make great jam? Absolutely. Probably the bulk of my jam base is from the Celeste. It's Heritage Fig of the South. It's what was used in the famed LSU breeding program. It says it never splits in heavy rain. It can, but it really can take a lot of liquid. But they are very small in fruit size, sometimes a large grape to a little larger. LSU Gold, this is the first of the non-big box store varieties. I think I actually picked this up at Autumn Hills, just into Cherokee County. It's not a pretty fig. You'll see the brown, what I call sugar spots on it. When it's dead ripe, I think it'll rival almost any other fig out there, but you really need to pick it dead ripe. If you look, you may be able to see my cursor at the very top of the fig at the neck will get very soft. You won't see much white pith, and that's really when I could tell I've picked it very, very ripe. And you're going to have a lot more sweetness. It'll be softer and much more enjoyable. Generally has a cold eye and can be humidity tolerant. LSU Purple is another from the LSU breeding program. It's going to be a very dark skin with an amber center. Excuse me. And another smaller fig, but very tasty. Pardon me. The Hunt almost has a banana flavor to it. And this is, if anybody says, are there any native figs to Georgia? I will say the Hunt with an asterisk because it was the result of a breeding program here. Chicago Hardy, you should be able to see some of this at some box stores and other nurseries around. Probably known as one of the more productive figs when you have heavy freezes. It's found originally in Chicago, unprotected, and it's always a good option. Tasty fig. I have two and do enjoy them. Flanders is another with medium to large size and can grow 3 crops. It is a slow grower. Violet de Bordeaux, or VDB, is another very flavorful fig. Flavorful fig. Excuse me. It's going to be slightly larger than the Celeste. A very tasty, complex flavor. I do highly recommend this one as well. Brooklyn White, more of a strawberry honey. And notice that some of these figs are named after an area, and that's generally where they've been found. Adriatic JH. Sometimes you'll see initials after the name of a fig. JH was a fellow fig grower that had discovered this Adriatic, and this is absolutely one of my favorites. Pardon my cough for a little bit. I was actually outside gardening for a good bit of the day yesterday, and we have this slight pollen problem right now. So this being one of my favorites, it still has a green fig. Sometimes you'll see figs with green skins referred to as a white versus a dark fig. It has a very rich strawberry raspberry center and almost a slight tartness. Absolutely love it and highly recommend it. Olympian is another more sugary caramel. Can be considered an English brown turkey type. Let me go ahead and say that you're going to find a lot of debate in the fig community that a number of figs might be referred to by a number of different names. Some of them are probably the same, but until we can do some genetic mapping on all of them, some of them may actually be the same fig, just with a slightly different name, depending on where they're coming out of. Desert King, this is the San Pedro we talked about earlier. This is the Breva crop. Absolutely amazing when you're able to get that to grow. I generally think it's a little better in the Pacific Northwest. And for anyone who has the figs in California, the main crop is incredible, but has to be pollinated. White Madeira #1. There are a couple figs. If you can actually find an actual one that has the roots in Madeira off the coast of Portugal, that are probably some of the most intensely flavored, most amazing figs you'll ever try. The White Madeira #1 is highly complex berry flavored. It is the green skinned fig. And I'd probably put this up there with just about any other fig. So talk a little bit about acquiring figs, because we've probably all seen them at the nursery. We've seen them in different areas. If you're on Facebook Marketplace, eBay, all these other places, there's a lot of people selling figs. I would encourage people to, while there may be some valid sources on eBay and Etsy and everything else, I think you're going to get a lot of figs that are not accurate. You're going to have somebody selling a Celeste as a much more expensive variety. I generally just avoid it. You're also going to find a number of sellers from overseas. It is illegal to import figs. There are no exceptions for anybody who's going to be looking to do this outside of a large commercial operation. And still then, it's probably not going to survive quarantine. Do not buy figs online. That's where pests like the ambrosia beetles and other things come into the country from. So please just don't do it. There have been people in the fig communities that have had a visit from the customs and had figs seized. I'd say avoid big box stores. I'd say for first figs and stuff like that, I have 2 figs in my front yard that came from the box stores. They're frequently mislabeled. I thought I had a Brown Turkey and a Celeste. I have 2 Celestes. I'd recommend only buying from reputable nurseries. I've had everything true to type from Pike. I've done well from Autumn Hills. There are a number around here. I don't want to selectively say some are better than others, but I think that there are options at real nurseries. Highly recommend you check out a site called FigBid. It is a nonprofit site. It's very well moderated and supported by most of the other fig forums, communities, Facebook groups. I've actually used this to sell cuttings for charity. I don't sell any for profit ever, but I think I've brought in $3,000 for Autism Speaks in charitable sales so far, and I'll probably do another the next time I get a good growth of cuttings to share. There's going to be a list in this presentation at the end. This is going to be available on YouTube later as well. I will give you a little caution. A lot of the figs, especially small figs, quart size, everything else, that are coming from tissue cultures. I've just had them take years to end up producing because of the very spidery growth. And I end up cutting back many of the branches and stems. So tissue cultures may be very easy to get. I just haven't had the success with them. Almost all of mine have really resulted from trading with other people. Strongly encourage you to look at ourfigs.com. I was looking for the St. Rita. I was there on the site, which is how I found it. And a gentleman in another part of the country saw my story and why I wanted it, and he just mailed the cuttings to me, and we're actually still friends today. A great group where folks share or sell extremely reasonably. So again, find other local fig enthusiasts. There's some local groups. I strongly encourage you. There's a not-for-profit, no-cost, free event each fall that I do up in Ottawa, Tennessee, just outside of Chattanooga, called the Fig Frolic. I have my email up here and also the email for Angel Miller over at Two Angels Mushrooms. We've probably, in the 3 years that we've done this, given away 150 fig trees. We've done a lot of trading. We've had a lot of participation by the master gardeners up in that area. We have folks come in from as far away as Mississippi through the Carolinas, and it's just a great group and a fun day. So we'll have more information on that in a bit. I have a number of references here. Of course, I have to start out with the UGA extension site. There are a number of publications that they have there. There's some good information and some videos with Two Angels Mushrooms, and I have to thank Angel for providing me a lot of the content and inspiration for this presentation. I strongly encourage you to look at, maybe even grab a screenshot or something. There's a link for our figs. They have an index of frequently referenced topics. That will answer almost every question that you could possibly have about figs. I do recommend it. Will's Figs, this gentleman who started our figs, he has a very reasonable site. There was a site that's now closed called Figs for Fun Forum. It's closed, but it's still available as a resource. So I still go back and look into some of the history of some of the figs there. Fig Boss, Fig Varieties, Figaholics. Some of these are on Facebook as well. I know Figaholics is. Mountainfigs.net. They have a great picture and graph of the different types of figs and flavors and sort of a nice palette. Tinkerbug's Figs and Fig Life. Again, I want to thank Angel Miller for and Two Angel Mushroom Farm providing a lot of the support and inspiration. So these, I'm going to leave that up for just a second if anyone wants to take a look at that. Again, this will be available on YouTube, and I believe that after this, everyone's going to get an email. I'll probably say this twice, but there'll be a survey and a request for feedback and request for other topics. So definitely do that when we get to that slide. This is the Fig Frolic event. Again, this is free. And I think we're going to be September 16th this year. There's a QR code if anyone wants to, if you want to check that out. We'd love to see you there. If you do come up and join, please let them know that you saw this video. We're going to take a little break for questions, and I hope I'm running about on time for everybody. Lee, let me know what you have, and hopefully I can answer it.
Yes, Ian. We've got a bunch of questions. Let's see how many we can get to. May I prune my Miss Piggy now?
I would say yes. And I've generally found the Miss Figgy to be a little bit of a slow grower, but yes. And I found it also to throw out a number of shoots. So I usually try to get it back to maybe 3, 4, 5 different shoots at most.
Okay. Is there a way to rid my tree of fungus disease, spots on yellow leaves?
So again, this is the leaf rust that we talked about early. I would say that if you know we're going to have a good rainy season, go ahead and give it an application according to instructions of a fungicide. I think what I have on hand now is the Bonide liquid copper. I like the organic solutions on that. But in advance of the rainy season, once you have the good leaf growth, so obviously we're too early right now, but I would say maybe as you start to get into maybe early to mid-July, I'd probably start looking at that.
Okay. My tree has not produced an abundance of figs. So disappointing. My father grew figs in Philadelphia, and we had an abundance of figs every year.
So a couple areas that I would usually look to. First, are you getting enough sun where it's placed? Second, are you fertilizing? Look at the fertilizing schedule. And then one of the reasons why I see the most issue in producing a number of figs is having too many branches, too much of a bush form. I'll find people with 20 different trunks, and it's really focusing on that vegetative growth instead of producing the figs. I might consider bringing it down to 3 to 5, 2 to 5 trunks, and then in the winter, probably still about now, I sometimes try to top them at a certain picking height. Some people let them go higher so they can leave some for the birds, but I would say fewer trunks, more fertilizer, more sun.
Thank you. The next question, we have 2 fig trees in our community garden. One has flourished and produced while the other is half the size. Can you provide suggestions to give the smaller tree nutrients and when? And Should large fig tree ever be pruned and when?
So as to when for pruning for either, I would probably going to want to stop pruning fairly soon because I think bud's going to start breaking. I usually prefer it over the winter, usually January into February. You can prune fig trees. You can take a large tree and cut it to the ground. It's going to grow back out for the most part. So I would prune according to the growth style and focusing on production. I sort of like a tulip or bowl shape, sort of like my hand upside down with the center trunk. I would look to prune the branches that are growing toward the center to allow more airflow and light coming into the center. And in terms of the smaller tree, I would again look at, what's the sunlight situation, what is how many trunks or branches are on it, and then start with the fertilization about now. And then I would probably go maybe 3 or 4 applications between now and September.
What is most common cause when a fig tree does not produce after 5 years?
If it's been producing and then stops producing after 5 years, I would probably consider looking at pruning or doing some different pruning. I'd look at, was there any change in the fertilization of it, or water availability? Did other things around it grow up and change the amount of sun that it's receiving? Those are probably the first things that I would look at with that.
Okay. How do you deal with ants?
Ants, I generally haven't had any issues or worries with. I know that my LSU Gold, I'll start to see ants when the figs get very ripe, and I start to have what I call the honey drip, when you have some of the sweetness and sugar dripping out of the ostiole. You can use, there are some products that you can, and I'm going to draw a blank on the name right now. There's almost a paste or tree block that you can put around the base that the ants just won't come up over. But in some of our areas, ants are going to do what ants are going to do, absent some sort of a barrier. Exclusion may be the only option.
Okay, I'm gonna, there's 3 related questions
Okay.
here. With the cold weather coming, how do you recommend protecting the new growth on in-ground figs? Can I leave my fig tree outside in a pot in the winter and cover with a blanket at nighttime when there's a frost? And how do you protect in-ground fig trees from frost in winter?
Okay, so this is where I would like to be able to do a lot of the things I'm going to mention, but I just have too many trees to really get out there. Okay, can you use normal cloth draping of the trees and do a wrap like you would for other plants? Absolutely. I usually don't get too worried about protecting from freeze unless I'm getting maybe below 26-ish. And then also how new of growth is it that I'm looking at. If you've pruned your trees, you usually look to prune so I can still pick, so I don't have as much of the small or tenderer tips to deal with. I'm less worried about getting that covered. But you can cover, you can mulch heavily to help protect the roots down below should you have an extreme freeze. I think 6 years ago we had down into the single digits into low teens. That's usually a kill back to the ground situation. You can heavily mulch and sometimes drape and do okay. I think I missed part of one of the questions. The container figs. You can leave some outside depending on the size of the container and how cold it's going to get. If you have a container, I had one in a 15-gallon container that did freeze to death this year. That's a pretty big container. If they're in container, and you definitely want to make sure they're protected during something down into the low 20s, I'd look at possibly moving them toward inside, moving them to the exterior wall of the home and covering them. But that again can be the challenge in trying to grow originally a Mediterranean plant outside of that kind of climate. This year I have had as small as a 4x9 tree pot that survives all winter, even with that hard cold. Those are generally the ones closer to the house in the brick exterior.
Okay. How do I know the figs are ripe and ready to be picked?
Excellent. Thank you. I'm glad you brought that back up because I probably should have had a full slide on this. Generally, the figs are going to get softer at the neck and droop a little bit. And there are some varieties that almost have no neck, so it's tougher there. I like to find a texture almost like a farm marshmallow. And I would say pick a first fig, and when you think it's ripe, and for the most part, the first time you think it's going to be ripe, it's probably going to take a couple more days. So I usually like them to get decently droopy. Sometimes the skin will crack a little bit, and it should almost fall off, or as you're taking it off, it's almost sometimes will tear at the neck. They will get softer than you're going to anticipate. When you open one up, you will see if you see a lot of the white pith, especially up towards the neck, it usually means that you're picking a little bit early. And I would say that almost everyone on the fig communities, we've all picked figs too early. We get excited about one. We have a heavy rain coming. We want to go ahead and give one a try. We pick early a lot of the time. The best way to tell if a fig is ripe is when that squirrel just ate it. So hopefully you can get ahead of that, but that's going to be common. That's a lot of organza bags come in handy with that. But I would say, especially if you have several figs, pick what you think is the ripest one, cut it in half and see how that pith and the neck's looking there, and say, okay, let me remember how this one looked, and let me give it an extra day or two on the next one.
Okay. Are the turkey figs considered a common fig?
Yes, brown turkey figs are common figs, very common around here. I guess also on the ripeness related, it's tough to have all your figs ripen at the same time. It's tough to get a lot of different varieties ripe at the same time. So how do I make all that jam at once? I usually start picking figs as they ripen. I eat a lot. My kids eat a lot just walking through the yard, and it's one of my favorite things to do after work. But if I take the very ripe figs, I put them on a paper plate, I put them on the freezer until they're frozen, then I put them in a freezer bag. I usually wait until the winter, and then I'll make my jam all at one time. And I usually have a medley of figs in the same jam.
Is it safe to plant a fig 4 feet from a south-facing wall and keep it pruned to 6 feet?
I would have no issue with that. You may see pictures from Italy in the Mediterranean where you see a giant fig growing up against the building. Not uncommon. Some people are worried about the roots causing some sort of structural damage. I haven't seen any, but I mean, if you're going to grow a 60-foot fig tree against questionable foundation, maybe that's not the best. But I know that in Monticello, Thomas Jefferson had a number of figs that he would intentionally plant towards southern walls. And the white Marseille was his favorite up there that he did that with. So I think that'd probably be a reasonable distance.
Okay. What's the best way to identify an existing fig tree species if you don't know what it is?
Very common question. A lot of people say, well, my leaves look like this. You really can't tell by the leaf shape, although it may provide some guidance as to one or another. I would say when you get the ripe figs, get a good photo of the exterior, cut them in half and get a picture of the interior, maybe with a couple pictures of the very common leaves. And then go to a forum like ourfigs.com and say, hey, does anyone have a guess? And if you know that your location, I'm going to tell you that the vast majority of the figs here in the Southeast are going to be Celeste or Brown Turkey, and they're pretty easy to tell the difference between one or another. If you see a green fig with a red interior here in the Southeast, the other green Aisha is one that we see a bit, another lovely fig. Almost impossible without genetic testing to tell you definitely this is this type of fig otherwise.
Ian, do you pinch your figs in summer?
You know, if I think that I'm getting a lot of vertical growth, I will occasionally pinch because I don't want a tree getting too high, too tall. This is when you have the green growth, sometimes you'll pinch or snap off the very tip of the branch. And that'll usually cause the fig to fruit or to throw out side branches. And it's a good way to sort of control the growth of the fig, depending on which one and what kind of growth I'm looking at, or if I'm getting a lot of green growth late in the season. I will pinch or prune.
Okay. One of our viewers said, with leaf rust, I've simply removed the leaves. The tree seems to do just fine. Is there any downside to this method?
No, I don't think so. And if you're going to remove them and dispose of them somewhere else, I think it's even better. Leaving the rusted leaves that drop at the bottom of the tree probably just leads to more problems in the future. So I have no issue with that. I do try to get as much of the green life of the leaf out of it as possible, just to feed the tree. But if you already have a yellow leaf that looks like it's done, I have zero issue with removing and disposing of those.
Okay. Can you give a recommendation for a small fig tree?
You're going to see some references to dwarf trees, and I would say that there are no truly dwarf trees. There may be some varieties or sports that have a lower growth profile. Somebody had mentioned a Miss Figgy earlier. I think that Miss Figgy is probably a Violet de Bordeaux, a VDB sport that has a more diminutive growth. I think it's also a slower grower and doesn't produce as much, but can be an option. I wouldn't hesitate, however, to prune the way that you need them to be. So you could have a fig that you have pruned starting, let's say, a single trunk at 2 or 3 feet, and then you develop a nice bowl shape to it, and then just cut it back every year to where you need it to maintain that size.
Okay. You've already explained how you know when they're ready to eat. Can figs stay on your counters, or do you refrigerate it? And how long will they stay fresh?
So figs do not ripen more once they've been picked. So if you pick it ripe, you got a ripe one. If you didn't pick it in time, it won't get any riper. I can usually have them on my counter for maybe a couple of days. I have put them in the refrigerator. Sometimes it's nice to have the chilled fig. They're probably gonna stay a little fresher, a little longer in the refrigerator. And then again, as long as you're protecting from a freezer burn, the freezer is definitely an option for a few months. But they will be very soft and probably best for jam once they're in the freezer.
Okay.
So I'd say probably a couple days.
Okay. One of our viewers commented that you can sprinkle ground cinnamon around the area under the tree and it will deter ants.
And it's a possibility. I generally avoid the gardening hacks. Most of that one is, there's a lot of benefits to cinnamon, but are you getting true cinnamon, or and I just blanked on the botanical name for the true cinnamon. There's a true cinnamon, and then there's a almost cinnamon, and I can't remember which, the Latacasia maybe. So that might be an option. You're going to hear a lot of other different things about other repellents. Maybe that's a good question for your extension agent to say. And actually, that's something I definitely want to mention. Once we're done with the questions, I'm going to reference our next presentation, which is going to deal with dealing with insects. So I would say tune in for our next presentation for some great ideas.
Okay. I think we'll let that be the last question. There's so many, and some of them were actually addressed during your presentation.
Okay.
Sorry we can't get to more, but go ahead, Ian.
Okay. And I'll look for this once it's posted on YouTube, and you'll see a link for the YouTube channel. I'll try to keep an eye on any questions that get posted on that YouTube posting, and try to answer any other questions if anyone has. Or if you do go to ourfigs.com, much to my wife's chagrin, my handle there is Backwoods Southern Lawyer. So look me up there and send me a question. We also want to talk about our Georgia Green Landscape Program. We want to especially thank our promotional partners who help make our organization and these presentations possible. We want to thank our media partners, all of them here, who help share the message about this. And special shout out to Ashley Frasca, who's been wonderful in interacting on Facebook and other groups, and has helped promote this as well. Thank you, Ashley. And we want to talk about the rest of our 2023 spring gardening lectures. Next up is Gabrielle Latora, who is our Fulton County Extension agent. She's absolutely wonderful and brilliant, and she's going to be talking about insect allies. That's going to be on March 19th. Some great things there. I know she has a focus on integrated pest management solutions as a true resource. And thought I mentioned something. Oh, sorry, that's right. The YouTube channel, you can see, I think we're getting close to 50. We're about 50 past classes, and that's the youtube.com/North Fulton Master Gardeners. Great resources. I'll be looking for this presentation and answering questions. And you can find out a lot more about us through our social media programs, everything from emails to YouTube and everything in between. And we want to also mention there's a lot of ways to donate and support the work of this organization, whether it's PayPal's, checks, donations, and especially the Give and Garden, which I'm going to touch on in the next slide. That is a great opportunity for all of us that I'm going to take advantage of. We have the online Spring 2023 Give and Garden sale. 50% of the proceeds go to support this group. You'll see a link for the order there. And for the first time, they have edible fruits and veggies. And since so much of what I do is an edible landscape, I am going to be taking full advantage of this. I would say get online early because there's some really good stuff that may go quickly. Also want you to save the date, Saturday, April 29th. We have our garden fair at the Grove at Wills Park. This is going to be an amazing opportunity with a lot of fun things to do, see, and learn. And we have our garden tour June 3rd. And I believe that this is the first time this is going to be open to the public beyond just the Master Gardeners. So it's a tour of 5 homes of the Master Gardeners in the Sandy Springs area. Some really great stuff to see, do, and learn from. And please, I think you're going to receive an email, if I'm correct, where you're going to get to fill out a survey. We want to know what you thought of this. I appreciate your constructive criticism and also feedback, what you did or didn't like, and ideas that you think you might have for future presentations. Sorry, and I think that that's what we have for today. I just really want to thank everyone for participating. I want to thank North Fulton Master Gardeners for helping me put this on, and all of our sponsors and supporters again as well. So thank you all very much, and I'll look for some questions on the YouTube post.